All right, we're gonna have a Bible time first. I'm gonna be doing the Bible time, and the two missionaries from Ukraine are going to do the sermon for me instead. So I kind of get a break. I'm very glad that I get a break, but I'm more glad that I can hear their stories as well. Today's Bible time topic is foreigners who live among you. And I'm sure that most of you guys would have heard about what is going on in Ukraine. And you see news all the time, and you hear people talking about the war in Ukraine all the time. And, we have been helping the refugees in Ukraine. And the people from Ukraine have to flee from all the war and the bombing. And especially many women and children, had to flee to neighboring countries like Slovakia. So if you can see in the map, they flee to a different country. And Slovakia is one of the countries that have the border next to Ukraine. And these missionaries that we have invited today are serving the Ukraine refugees at the border between Ukraine and Slovakia. So as you can see in the next picture, as you see those refugees, you might have some strong feelings, and you might also have some questions. You might also be thinking to yourself, what do those people have in common with me? And why or how should we think about them, the whole situation? Or why should we even care about them? And I think that is a very valid question that you might have. So I am going to give you guys some reasons why that we should actually care about them, and we should pray for them, and we should help them, based on our faith that we confess as Christians. Number one reason why we should care about them. It is because simply the Bible tells us to care about foreigners and the refugees. Let's read Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 and 34 together in one loud voice, okay? 1, 2, 3. Do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you love yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. The Bible tells us not to take advantage of the foreigners and not to mistreat them. Why do you think foreigners exist to begin with? Why don't they reside in their own land, own country, and why do they have to travel to a different country? There could be many reasons why, and I think, largely there are two reasons. Number one, something happened in their homeland and they have to flee from all of the difficulties, maybe a war, maybe hunger, maybe famine, and their lives became so difficult in their homeland, and that's why they have to flee to a different country. The other case would be you are looking for a better opportunity, you are very ambitious, and you want even greater things for you, so you can go to a different country to look for better education and better chance of living. Back in the Bible time, which of those two cases were more true, do you think? I think it was the first case. Because the life in their homeland was so difficult, they had to flee to a different country. And it turned out that where Israelites lived, there were also many, many foreigners. And God specifically tells them, take care of them and love them, and treat them like how you would treat your native-born Israelites. And that is simply what the Bible tells us to do, and that's what we should do. Is that pretty clear? There's another reason. At the end of verse 34, it says, remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. If you guys remember the history of Israelites, how did they end up in Egypt? Does anyone know how they kind of ended up there and became these big people? There was a famine, right? And through Joseph and his family, they kind of ended up in Egypt, and they multiplied and they became these big group of people. But how did the Egyptians treat the Israelites? Over time, they started to mistreat the Israelites. So the Israelites, at the core of Israel's history, at the core of Bible's history, you see this struggle, you see the struggle between the Egyptians and the Israelites, the oppressors and the oppressed, and that is one of the central themes throughout the Bible. God's people, Israel, have been persecuted and mistreated by the people in Egypt. And God says, hey, you Israelites, do not ever forget about experience. And through that experience, God has led them and God has really formed and shaped their spirituality. And God says, do not ever become the persecutors, because you have been persecuted, you have been mistreated. Do not ever forget what it means to be the weak people. That is God's will. And as Israelites made their way out of Egypt, what do we call that? Their travel outside of Egypt. It's called the Exodus, right? You guys remember Exodus? That's the whole story of Exodus. And Israelites made their way out, and God continues to remind them, do not forget about, you being the foreigners and you kind of being the refugees, and do not ever forget about that. And if you actually read the Old Testament through the perspective of Israelites as the foreigners and the refugees, it's going to make a lot of sense, and it's going to bring a whole new understanding of the context behind the Old Testament. And number 3, another reason why we should care about them is because we are Koreans living in America. Perhaps you were born in Korea and you came to the States, or perhaps your parents came, or perhaps your ancestors came, but we Koreans in our own nature, we are foreigners in this land. I realize that I spend more time in the States than the time that I spent in Korea. However, I am always going to have my accent. I am always going to love my Korean food, and I am always going to have easier time connecting with Koreans other than Americans. I find myself becoming a completely different person when I speak to Americans. It's just much more difficult to connect to them. We're always going to be a part of a Korean church. I love the Korean heritage. That does not mean that we should be exclusive, but however, I think we embrace and we cherish our root and our heritage as Korean Americans. Have you guys ever watched this movie, Minari? Who has watched this movie? Many of you guys. That's great. If you guys have not, I highly encourage you guys to watch this movie. This movie is about a family who have immigrated from Korea to the States and the struggles that they go through. And I watched this movie and it made my heart warm and sad at the same time many times. And I think that that's a great depiction of what it means to live as a foreigner in a foreign land. You guys as Korean Americans, this is the wish and the dream that I have for you. I wish that you become versatile people, both in terms of getting a job and forming a family, and also in terms of doing your faith. I really want to equip you and shape you guys in the way that if you ever get plugged into an American church, you do great there, right? However, if you also decide to be a part of the Korean church, you should also, have the freedom, and you should also feel comfortable being a part of Korean church in whichever path and whichever way that God leads you to become. I really want to instill you guys a sense of, hey, we're Christians, and everyone who profess the same name of God, they're all our brothers and sisters, and we should have a global perspective as Christians. However, we should also cherish, we should also embrace the fact that God has made us Koreans, and some parts of that will never change, and it's not anything to be ashamed of. It's not something to embrace, and it's not something to cherish and become grateful and thankful about. So I have given you guys 3 reasons why you should definitely care about the foreigners and the refugees. Number 1, because the Bible tells us to do so. What was number 2? Anybody remember? Have you guys already forgotten? What's number 2? Because of Israelites' history. They were foreigners, and God tells throughout the Bible, never forget about that. Number 3, we are Korean Americans living in this land as foreigners, so we should give extra care, extra prayer for the foreigners. And if any of that made sense to you guys this week, I want you to really pray for the people in Ukraine. And when you read the Bible, think in the terms of how God wants you guys to think about, pray for, and be nice to the refugees and foreigners among you. All right. With that, I'm going to dismiss you guys. You guys may rise and follow your teachers.